All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. I just wanted to say good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Student Association of Fire Ecology's Connections webinar series. My name is Matt Behrens. I'm a master's student at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. I'm also a member of the National Safe Leadership Team who assisted in planning this webinar series, and I'll be the host for today. Um, this is the third of 6 webinars the Student Association for Fire Ecology is hosting this academic year. And our intent for these webinars is to create a forum for students and early career fire ecologists to hear from a diverse group of active and influential professionals and to have a forum for discussing with both the guest speaker and other attendees. So I want to sincerely thank all of you for joining us and convey that we're all in the right place and these webinars are for us. It's for us to make them, us as participants, to make them what we need and what we want out of them. Before I introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mary Lata, I'll go over a couple housekeeping items real quick. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll be posting it to the SAFE website. Typically takes a couple days for us to get that out. Please feel free to add any questions you have to the Q&A chat throughout the presentation. Mary asked that you also interrupt her if you have a question that's relevant to what she's talking about. This is a small forum, a small group, so pertinent questions, let's ask them. I'm also going to take a moment to let everyone know about some of the other SAFE events that are coming up. The biggest one on the very near horizon is the Southwest Fire Ecology Conference, which is happening next week in Santa Fe, New Mexico. If you are planning to attend that conference, look out for a few student-specific events we have planned, and it'd be great to meet you all in person. We'll also be hosting an annual all-chapter SAFE meeting virtually in February, and this is mainly for the university chapters to hear what everyone else is doing and connect. But it's also a great opportunity for folks who aren't at a university to hear what some of these programs and other clubs are doing. So it should be really helpful for everyone. And again, that's going to be in February. And then thirdly, this webinar series is going to continue in the spring. 3 more installments, so be on the lookout for those beginning in February. So now that I've talked enough, let me introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Mary Lata. I'm going to do a quick introduction, actually. I'm not quite done. And then hand it over to her. So Dr. Lata's fire career started in the early 90s with 3 seasons of restoration work with the TNC and focused mainly on grassland restoration. She then worked as an interpretive ranger at Badlands National Park, where she got some first taste of wildfire, and then continued into that a little bit more in Bandelier National Monument and got really into wildland fire use as well. She completed her PhD research at University of Iowa with a focus on thermal dynamics of grass fire and how soil moisture affects fire behavior and fire effects. In 2002, she began to work full-time as a fire ecologist for the Nebraska National Forest and Grasslands. And then in 2010, with an eye to the restoration of fire regimes on a landscape scale, she moved to Flagstaff, here where I am, and for 8 years was a fire ecologist on the core team for the Four Forests Restoration Initiative, which restored landscape scale fire to the region. She's now a fire ecologist on the Tonto National Forest and has gotten really heavily engaged in the ecological feature of the Sonoran Desert, which has a lot of introduced grasses coming in, resulting in a novel fire regime in the region. So there's some really interesting work that she's done, and we're excited to hear from her today. So thank you for joining us, Mary. At this point, I'll hand it over to you, and I'll stop my screen share.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me. Excuse me. Matt did a pretty thorough introduction. Oh, that didn't work. Try that again. Let's try this one more time. Tell me when you're looking at my screen.
Yep, I see your desktop.
All right. My first slide, actually, I'm going to start with this slide. I don't put slides up generally with pictures anyway, unless I intend to talk about them. So you guys are all in fire ecology, so I'm not going to be going into the depths of discussion that I normally would on some of these. But just to point out initially, you can see the waves and bellowing clouds of flammable gas coming off of this large piece of fuel here. If we don't think about it in this way, sometimes it's a little harder to think about fire clearly. So fire is flammable gases that are have particulates within them, And those particulates are oxidizing quickly from the outside in. That is what we see as a flame. So the glowing part is the outside of that cloud of gas, which is oxidizing. We see that obviously in the beauty of flames, which is pretty cool. So keeping that in mind, it's all about, really it comes down to combustion. Initially, that makes all the difference in what we see in the whole fire regime. So real quick, you kind of went through it, but this was a slide I put together for a wildlife class who wanted to know how do you get to be a fire ecologist with the Forest Service. I was born and raised in Iowa City, Iowa. This was in the 60s, so the family got stuffed into a large station wagon. There were 7 of us, and we always went out west and went camping and backpacking for probably 2 or 3 weeks every year. Usually to Glacier National Park. That remains my favorite place on the face of the earth. At one point then, this is jumping forward past a whole different career in music, I ended up going out to Connecticut. Too many trees out there, you couldn't see the landscape. I didn't like that, so after 3 years, I went to where I really wanted to be, back to Montana, to the University of Montana, but then realized after just a couple of semesters that I still had in-state tuition in Iowa, and it was foolish to ignore it because it's a good school. So then I started working summers. I had an internship with the Nature Conservancy, working mostly on tallgrass restoration and northern mixed-grass prairie restoration as well in the Great Plains. And then started working for the Park Service, which was when I really dug into wildland fire. My first fire crews started there, got my firefighter 2 by working on several. Went to Bandelier National Park as fire effects monitor. I ended up getting firefighter 1 there. And then started my first full-time job on the Nebraska National Forest and grasslands, that's South Dakota and Nebraska. And I keep bringing up my qualifications as well, because there are not enough right now, I think, people working in fire who have a higher level of education as well as fire qualifications. There's certainly a lot of us out there. But I will say that when I'm first meeting new fire folks now, I won't tell them if I have anything about my education, because it seems to make it hard to get to know them until they've known me a while. So from Nebraska, as was brought up, I was interested in getting stuff done on a bigger scale. And so I came to work for the Forest Restoration Initiative and then ended up on the Tonto, where I'm at now. I'm speaking to you from the Payson Ranger District office, which is where my duty station is here. So I've worked for about 24 years for the Forest Service as a fire ecologist, and this is my, I was going to say my favorite job. Probably my favorite job ever was as a fire effects monitor out of Bandelier, but this is a close second, and it's probably second mostly because I have a lot more responsibility than I did as a seasonal GS5. So these are all the things that I have slides to talk about today, and it's probably not realistic to get to them all. Please interrupt and ask questions whenever you have them as I go through this. So this first part is going to be probably a little basic, but there's a reason I want to be talking about it first. So disturbance ecology, of course, is what fire ecology is all about. Fire is a very special kind of disturbance, but every disturbance has its own regime in terms of its frequency, its severity, what is affected, how is it affected, all of that. And fire, of course, is pretty specific in terms of what it needs. Earth, interestingly enough, is the only celestial body other than stars that we know of that can have fire. So it's just us and the stars, which is pretty cool. And it's that fire triangle that makes that real. You have to have oxygen, you have to have ignition, you have to have fuel. Nobody else has that except us and the stars. So if you're talking about a disturbance regime, I'm assuming most of you know then already that it is the extreme disturbances which kind of set the stage for what is the norm within a system. If you're talking about flooding, it's that 1,000-year flood that carves out the farthest sides of the valley that then become part of your riparian area, not your 100-year flood. And so the same is true for fire, in that those extreme fire events are going to change the landscape for a very long time, sometimes kind of permanent. It's most common when we talk about fire regimes to talk about frequency and severity. And I will say, since I started working on the Tonto close to 7 years ago now, I have come to include patch size always. It's absolutely critical to some of the ecosystems we have here, especially those that are dependent on high severity fire. So this is the pretty standard. There are different ways, and I'm sure you've all heard some of them, of describing a fire regime and what a fire regime is. But having worked for the government now for almost 30 years, counting Park Service stuff as well, this is what we use. And this is also very standard. There are some researchers out there, some of whom I don't have a lot of respect for, others whom I do, who tend to change these so that they can describe things the way they would like to. But this is pretty standard for what we see in the Southwest anyway. We'll have some discussion. Hopefully I'll still have time at the end there on what something like the Sonoran Desert really is, in terms of that's Fire Regime 5 there. A lot of discussion on the desert right now. But those first two fire regimes 1 and 2, they're both frequent fire. So of course you look at the landscape of the United States, and of course this isn't including Alaska, and realize, wow, there used to be a ton of fire around here and there isn't anymore. Or maybe it's more about the right kind of fire versus the wrong. So I would say mostly we just don't have enough of the right kind of fire. We have more fire deficit than we do too much fire, if you're just talking acreage across this country anyway. So there are tons and tons of ecological roles of fire which apply to what you're going to do if you work in land management, and trying to figure out where your priorities should be, what you should be focused on, which other specialists you need to be working with. If you're working out of fuels and fire management, what are your priorities? Where should you be spending your time? Are you working with wilderness? Are you working with wildlife? Are you working with recreation? Is it about timber sales? What is it? And there's more. When you start getting down in the weeds, the things that fire does are the things that you as a fire ecologist need to know about. And it's not just what you can talk about what the fire does, all these things. You need to look at the sequence of how these things happen and how they happen. So initially there's the scale, of course. When we're talking about a land management plan, whether it's Forest Service, whether it's BLM, Nature Conservancy, Park Service, then you need to be looking across your landscape and trying to figure out what you would consider to be healthy fire on that landscape, and how much of the landscape does it affect, and how does it interact with other parts of the landscape. This is Single Shot Mountain there, on the east side of Glacier National Park, and that was the Red Eagle fire in the foreground. There was nothing wrong with that fire from an ecological perspective. It was time for that to burn. It was mostly lodgepole pine, but of course a lot of the visitors don't see it that way, and they blame the Park Service for mismanagement and all the usual kind of misinformation stuff in regards to ecology. When you tone it down a little bit, if you become a land manager at any level for any agency, then you're going to be looking at what I'm calling here functional groupings. This can be vegetation type. It can be geographic location on the landscape, whether you're talking about riparian or uplands. It's a way that you sort of start to divide the landscape up. And this would be something you would carefully consider when you're coming up with projects, whether it's fuels reduction, some kind of restoration, whatever your objectives are. You're usually going to be dealing with functional groups at that scale. And so fire, if you're looking at the same kind of fire that you are above, so lodgepole pine, large scale, infrequent, high severity, what does that look like when you have, let's say you have a project area that's just in the WUI area around a community, and the whole thing is really only about 500 acres. Is it okay to burn the whole thing down? Maybe. Then you get to your objectives. And then, of course, the fine scale. Sometimes it's an individual tree. Sometimes it's a small population of flora or fauna. But these are really important things in how you think about fire, and as a manager, how you interact with the other resource specialists. And this is really basic, but this is really critical, I think, to always be keeping in mind first and second order fire effects. First order fire effects are pretty straightforward. What did it just do? It just finished smoking. Now what's different? There's a ton of things that are different. Even looking at this, I was going to ask you guys, but I can't see you, so I'm just going to list some of them. One is you've exposed the mineral soil in a lot of this area. Because it's so black, I'm assuming, I know for a fact, it didn't burn everything up. It charred a lot of it, and a lot of it burned up, but there's still some material sitting there, because this was a grasslands. It's changed the albedo, so this area is going to heat up faster now. That means it's going to dry up faster now. So the dry up is a second order fire effect. The change in albedo is first order fire effects. But it's that kind of thing of looking at what just happened, And what does that mean? It's a cascading effect. So from one first order fire effect can lead to a bazillion different post fire effects. In terms of second order fire effects, exactly what happens, of course, depends on the pre and post conditions. So this is just one example. And I'm going here right now because one of the things that I tend to dig into a lot on this forest, it's the questions I ask a lot when they come up with projects, is the soil, because soil is not sexy. It's not something people go, oh, let's see this soil. It's blooming now. Or, no, it's soil. That's wait, it doesn't. You know, how many people ever went on a field trip to go see some cool soil and mean outside of your soil classes? Not many. So one first order effect is that change to the chemical and physical forms of things like nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and carbon, which are critical for plant growth. So that's your first order effect. It went from being locked up in litter, in wood, in dead and live plant stuff, to now being in forms, many of which are much more available. So what happens? This is your first second order fire effect, is it's going to affect plant growth. And that in turn affects the soil structure, because when you have roots, they are affecting your soil structure by their contribution to the organic matter and their physical ability to kind of burrow through the soil and make holes, macro and micro holes in the surface. Grasses in particular, we know can shed, say, up to 30% of their rootage every year. A little more, a little less, depends on what happens. And that contributes, of course, to the organic matter in the A horizon especially, so that it changes your soil structure. Oops. And that affects infiltration. So the next time it rains, now more of the water can theoretically go down into the soil. We actually tested this in a geomorph class I took at Iowa, and boy, was it true. After a couple of years, the infiltration increased quite a bit in areas that had burned and were healthy otherwise. The infiltration, because it changes the soil moisture and to a lesser degree the soil temperature, because of your water content then, changes the soil biota. And that goes on to change the decomposition rate and amount and all of that. There's a lot of changes that come from the decomposition of organic matter in the soil. And going back around to that second order fire effect of plant growth, then it changes habitat based on what's growing there. Everything from bacteria in the soil up through grizzly bears. They're all affected by what's growing. And so, of course, fauna. And then, of course, plant growth also is going to increase soil surface stability if it's not otherwise disturbed, and it's an area that evolved with a lot of fire, such as a grassland or ponderosa pine, which, of course, the fire mostly runs on grass in a healthy pine forest anyway. So you have increased surface stability that affects soil erosion and all of this. So all this comes back to the first order fire effect. And so when you're working on fire, when you're writing a burn plan, when you're a fire effects monitor, whatever it is, it all comes down to documenting and trying to control the first order fire effects. In this case, this is the Red Eagle fire again outside of Glacier. You can see that the first order fire effects created a really nice mosaic on this landscape. So you can imagine if you put fire across this landscape again, it's going to look quite different. It's going to burn differently in the different seral stages here of the vegetation. And that is another critical component of fire. So this is all just to drive home the importance of first order fire effects and understanding them really well, because they are going to make possible whatever second order fire effects happen. And our ability to control or mitigate first order fire effects is what it's all about. A guy named James Brown is the one who wrote the protocols that we use as Brown's lines or fuels inventory. Originally, I think he wrote it in the early 70s. He also had said something once about when you're writing objectives for a burn plan, all you really need to write is what do you want to kill and what do you want to consume. Everything else is a second order fire effect and not really going to be that affected by what you do on that burn right away, unless you learn to control the weather. So then this is about, what do you think the footprint of a fire really is? So I mentioned that fire changes the form of various chemicals, many of which are important for plant growth. And so certainly in an area that has just burned, you've got that shift. And as long as it stays on site, you're going to have an increase in available nutrients. In a frequent fire system, it's as if you're fertilizing it every time you burn it. And that is one of the reasons why it's important to not judge the effects of a fire in a frequent fire system based on the effects of just one fire. If you burn it just once, that's a very different effect than if you burned it, say, 6 times over a 20-year period. You're going to see a huge difference in what can grow there and how well it grows because of the nutrient availability. So in this case, this is the Pinal fire in 2017, just south of Globe, and we got an ash swirl there. So that ash has a lot of nutrients in it. And as you can see, they're getting sucked up into this ash swirl, and they move off-site. And so in the direction that this ash swirl is moving is all chaparral. And this fire at this point in this location is mostly done burning, so we're not concerned, well, we were, but there wasn't a problem, of there being any live embers. This is more a matter of looking at where that ash is moving to and what's benefiting from the ash. So it dissipates there on that hill of chaparral. So what's the footprint of the effects of this fire then? How would you map that? Would you map it? I absolutely think it's relevant and it's legitimate and it's definitely fire effects, but it is certainly not within the footprint of the fire itself. And that happens all the time. So this is one, where I lived in Shadron, Nebraska for a long time. This is what happened in 2006. We had all these fires, but look at where the smoke's going. Where that smoke settles down, it's putting down nutrients. I'm going to talk about smoke effects at the very end and smoke ecology, but again, this is about where the smoke settles. Smoke definitely has an ecological role, and we don't understand it very well yet. This is showing just about a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago, up in Idaho in that area, and look at all the smoke everywhere. Some folks in Australia and in South Africa actually are light years ahead of us in terms of their knowledge of smoke ecology. We've had some folks in this country now starting to work on it. I'll get to most of that later. But at this point, just to say, it really doesn't take much smoke residue to affect the germination of an awful lot of species, including lettuce, by the way, which I thought was quite interesting. But anyway. So also, when you're in land management, thinking about the long and the short-term effects of fire is really important. So this is loud, there we go. This is some video that was taken by a bear team after the Schultz fire just north of Flagstaff. They were out there doing an assessment, and there was a 4-inch rainfall, which resulted in this. It also resulted in the death of an 11-year-old girl who got stuck in a culvert just downstream from here. But the point is, you can see the color of this water. It's not all black. A lot of it is brown. A lot of that is topsoil. And this was ponderosa pine. And in this particular case, you can see it wasn't that the pine was super close together. It was moderately close canopy, but just barely. And so when you lose soil like that, it's not ever going to be able to really support the exact same vegetation. In Iowa, where we used to have the best soil in the world by evaluation of many people I studied with anyway. We're kind of soil snobs if you're from Iowa. But even there, it takes 100 years to produce 1 inch of topsoil. So in an area as dry as northern Arizona is for much of the year, this area here just lost an awful lot of ground. And then you throw climate change in on it, and you throw more uncharacteristic fire. And by that, I simply mean fire of a type, size, severity that this area did not evolve with, and these effects on some level are certainly permanent. We don't know where it's going to go because of climate change. We have the common ways of looking at fire history. Most of us, I certainly love looking at old pictures, but there's a lot of them out there. This is 1912 in northwestern Nebraska. The bottom one is 1999, it's a couple years before I got there. And, that's kind of what we're all used to seeing, right? If you go up to the extreme northern climates, this is in Alaska, and try and understand the fire history there, you have to dig down deep and look for the charcoal layers. That's an area with white and black spruce, of course, which burns infrequently with high severity, kind of burns to the ground. But really the only way there to get a handle on it is to dig down and do some radiocarbon dating. I'm not going to dig into that too much because I much prefer to live in areas where there's more frequent fire than not. It's more interesting. And we've all seen these, so I'm not going to dig into this too much. I want to talk a little bit about the fire history on the Tonto. So this is where I work. I actually was meaning to ask before I started where you all are from. There aren't so many of you that we can't get that. Matt, could you have folks type in the chat where they're from and then interrupt me when they've typed it? I can't see the chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for those of you who don't know the Tonto, you can see it there. It's a pretty big forest, one of the biggest, just shy of 3 million acres. And we also have the highest fire load of any forest in the Southwest, and I think certainly one of the highest in the country in terms of how much fire we get every year. And so then you always break it down, right, into human-caused fires and lightning-caused fires. And so this next sequence, I use this a lot, but it's a good sequence, and you'll see why if you haven't seen it before. What you're going to see here is a sequence of 10 years worth of lightning broken out by the month. So there's a little bit of tiny little red dots here that you can't even see unless you know they're there.
Mary, let me just bump in
Sure.
here and tell you where we're from. So we've got folks from Las Vegas, Nevada, Northeast Minnesota, Illinois, Colorado, Moscow, Idaho, Washington, Rochester, New York, folks in Vermont as well. Yeah, so we're actually all over the country right now, which is
Awesome. Great. Yeah, that's great. Oh, and you folks in the East, I assume you've all read Changes in the Land. There's a lot in there. And prevert. Well, and we'll get off on a squirrel again. Thank you for that. So I'll know a little bit how much to talk about here, about what. So this is February lightning, and then March and April. And before I go a whole lot farther, for those of you who are not from the Southwest, this area down here in the southwest corner of this map, and then this area in here where there's a big lake, is all Sonoran Desert. And full-on Sonoran Desert, we're talking roadrunners and saguaro cactus and the whole 9 yards. And so that area starts to really heat up in, usually it's like late March, sometimes in through April. It starts to get really hot and really dry, and hotter and hotter and hotter. And we get virtually no rain, literally, from, say, mid-April till about the 1st of July. That's been the pattern for the last few hundred years anyway. And as this area here in the Southwest, the Sonoran Desert, heats up, the strength of that upward movement of the hot air starts to suck in more moisture from the Gulf of California, that's right off the Baja Peninsula, and sometimes the Gulf of Mexico as well. So as eventually it starts to pull in moisture, and sometime in late in late June, we'll start to see a buildup of clouds in the afternoons. And then that gets more and more intense, and eventually we start to see storms with dry lightning, and then those storms get wet. And so when monsoon kicks in, which typically has been in early July, then we start to see rain sometimes every day for a while, and certainly every week for a couple of months. And they're pretty intense storms. But first it's dry lightning, and then it becomes basically wet lightning, so that you can imagine the nature of the storms and the nature of the fires change quite a bit. Those early fires in June, before monsoon really kicks in, tend to be bigger, hotter, higher severity, wind-driven, pretty nasty stuff sometimes in terms of what we really want to see, because it's growing through areas we've been keeping fire out of. And then as monsoon kicks in, it's wetter out, and the storms come with rain as well, and so those fires are good. And we should have hundreds of fires going all the time, but we're still good at putting those out. Anyway, so here's April. You can see a little more red. And as we get into May, sometimes there's a random storm, mostly in the higher country. I'll point out, too, that this line up here at the top, this is the Mogollon Rim. This is a huge escarpment that has a displacement of up to 3,000 feet. So that up on top of this, it gets a little bit above 8,000 feet in some places. Typically, it's above 7. And then as you get down, this is only 45-minute drive from Payson down into the desert, where your elevation is down less than 2,000 feet. So it's a pretty dramatic area. And then, so there's May, and then June, we start to get early monsoon showing up. Each one of these is a lightning stroke, cloud to ground, all the way. And then July pops in. And you figure most of the area that is at the higher elevations here is populated by ponderosa pine, the needles of which are extremely flammable. So when you put together this kind of lightning and ponderosa pine, there is no question there was a lot of fire on this landscape always. And there always will be until we cure one or the other. So November or December, it kind of peters off. Here's how that translates into fires on the ground. These are lightning fires over a 54-year period on the Tonto National Forest. So you can see the Mogollon Rim up here. You get the orographic lifting because most of our winds, most of our weather comes from the southwest most of the time. So as it moves up here, there's a small mountain, well, it's not that small. There's a mountain range here called the Mazatzals. This is the Four Peaks Wilderness, more mountains there. Down here, it's the Pinell Mountains. These are the Sierra Anchas. So obviously, not a big surprise, lightning fires, there's a lot more of them at higher elevations, as you would expect. And then there's that symbiotic relationship of what grows there is going to be something that can handle a lot of fire, which tends to mostly be ponderosa pine in our case. And then here's the other side of it. So here's the human-caused fires over that same period. And, you know, I've often wondered what this would look like if we could look at human-caused fires, say, 500 years ago. Obviously, some of the pathways would be the same, but you know, if you live in a landscape that is mostly flammable a lot of the time, and you have 12-year-old kids who are out there playing around, and you need to use fire for cooking, you need to use fire for heating, there's going to be a lot of fires where you are. But here's something that unfortunately I don't see talked about enough. I mean, we talk about the natural fire regime, which is the lightning fires on the right, but we can't separate those in reality on the ground. They may answer some questions if we separate them in regards to evolution of these areas, but in terms of our current fire regime, this line here is Highway 87 between Phoenix and Payson, and then it goes up to the Mogollon Rim either this way or this way. And the whole town of Phoenix seems to come up when it's hot down there. They come up every weekend. There's a lot of traffic, and as you drive along this highway, you can see frequent fire. This area was mostly Sonoran Desert down here. It's turning into a grassland. Here it basically is one now. Let's see if I've left enough time at the end to talk about that. But in my mind, if you really want to understand what you're seeing out of the window when you're out there, you have to combine these two. That's what the actual real current fire regime is. If you want to just look at the natural fire regime, that's nice, but it's not going to answer the questions you have when you look out the window. It's not going to explain what we see out there. It's not going to explain what's happening, and it's not going to change. Phoenix is unfortunately still growing at a pretty ferocious rate, and people are still accidentally and otherwise starting fires all over the place. So without going into a lot of details on which color is what kind of system here, this is just to show it's a very complex landscape. And another thing that I don't think gets enough attention in terms of fire ecology are ecotones. And I know you all know what ecotones are. So, for example, the purple here is all Sonoran Desert. This orange is chaparral. So here's a system that isn't supposed to be able to get used to much fire at all. And here's one that's used to burning to the ground about every 35 to 100 years. And weirder yet, this yellow are maps semi-desert grasslands that are a frequent fire system. And we actually think they probably burned about every 10 to 15 years. And they interface directly with the desert. And so do all of these other systems. I won't go into what all of them are. So what I've done, especially when I'm talking with the public or other managers who don't have a good background to get into the gory details without losing them, to break it down simply into fire frequency here. So obviously the desert is still purple. Water is blue, as it should be. The orange are the infrequent fire systems. And for us, that includes a number of shrub systems, as well as some wet mix conifer up on top. And that would cover a lot of some of the forests in the Northeast as well. The white pine up there. I wish I knew those systems better, but I don't. And the yellow are the frequent fire systems. So for us, that's mostly semi-desert grasslands, ponderosa pine dominated systems, and various woodland types where we have widely spaced pinyon, juniper, and oak. So it's still, even when you break it down to this, it's a pretty complex thing to try and figure out. And we're supposed to manage it. So this is just one of our ranger districts, and this is pretty basic fire ecology, but again, these are the things that I use on the job all the time. These are things I talk about and I share with other people, the level at which we need to share information about fire ecology, things that they need to know. So these are, for us, I'll just say vegetation types for the moment. They're ecological response units. And here's how we consider them on our district. So this is the Payson Ranger District has about 103,000 acres of ponderosa pine evergreen oak. That's not the same as the more typical ponderosa pine in my mind that's up on top of the Mogollon Rim. We have more frequent fire. Anyway, so typically we would get fire about every 5 years, and we have a lot of good data to prove that. Cross sections, fire studies that have been done. So we know that this is pretty accurate to say that we had fires from every year to sometimes up to 60 years, but typically they were about every 5 years. And as a manager, what that means in terms of trying to keep the right kind of and the right amount of fire on the ground is if we're going to manage for a 5-year fire return interval, we need to be seeing about 20,700 acres of fire on the ground every year-ish. We can get away with a little less than that. But that's just that one vegetation type, and that's just one of 6 districts. So we're never going to get enough of the right kind of fire on the ground to maintain or sustain or restore what was here once upon a time. We don't talk so much about restoration anymore as we used to because things have changed. What's out there has changed partly because of high severity fires in large areas and, of course, the climate, and then our usage and our ability to understand these systems. Just a quick check-in. We have till 4.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. I'm going to rip through some of this real quick then to get to some more interesting stuff at the end. I always like talking about smoke ecology and getting feedback from the rest of you on that. This was just showing the pre and post conditions. This is one of the ways you judge how often fire can or should burn through an area. This is the ponderosa pine evergreen oak. You can see the oak there. This is an area that we had no fire history on for at least probably 50 to 70 years before the juniper fire in 2016, immediately post-fire, 1 year later. And notice there really isn't here, there is not a single herbaceous plant within 4 meters of this or the other 6 plots that I put in here. Not one, there's too much litter. So as we go forward in time here, we can see, now this is mostly annual stuff coming in, but there are herbaceous plants coming in now. And we went back last summer to read these plots, and this is what it looks like. So this is 8 years without fire, and there was a fire study, a cross-section taken as the crow flies probably about 3 miles from here that showed a fire return interval of about 7 years, and this definitely holds that true. As you can see, the ladder field's starting to come back real quick there after just 8 years. I'm going to assume that you all know the difference between severity and intensity, and I'm not going to go into that much. Not going to go into this much, although it looks kind of cool. That was the Pinal fire in 2017. The black area that is still burning there is the Telegraph fire in 2021, which came from left to right and slammed into this part of the Pinal fire. This northern part was chaparral, and in the Pinal fire it burned with high severity. And even right now, if you went out there with a terra torch, you could not get it to burn because chaparral cannot burn that frequently. And so this was the Telegraph fire burning close to that area, in an area obviously that did not burn in the Pinal fire. And you notice there's a ponderosa pine in the foreground there and another one to the right in the foreground. But ponderosa pine also encroaches into chaparral, just like chaparral shrub species encroach into the pine. And you can see that pine isn't very old. And so this was a good thing for this to be taking that pine out, although there had been fire there too frequently. This one is going to actually probably kill some of the shrubs in that area because it shouldn't have burned quite so soon. But that interaction of the ecotones is something that we've been watching, especially, and I know I'm kind of bouncing all over the place, where we have chaparral that builds and goes up a slope and ends up translating into ponderosa pine as it gets higher. So originally that ecotone, we don't know for sure because we don't have many natural ones, wouldn't necessarily have been that broad. But chaparral is capable of extreme fire behavior. It likes to burn to the ground, as I said, every 35 to 100 years-ish, depending on the oak component. And ponderosa pine is, well, and chaparral is not flammable for a big chunk of the year. You cannot get it to burn. We have actually burned against it sometimes because we know it's not flammable and it won't burn at certain times of the year. That's useful. Ponderosa pine, on the other hand, is flammable at the surface anyway. The needles are going to be flammable pretty much whenever they're dry, but it doesn't do extreme fire behavior when it's in a good condition. So you have these two very different fire regimes side by side, and the ecotone itself is more flammable because it has the needles of the ponderosa pine that make it super flammable, and the needle drape comes down on top of the chaparral species that have started to move into the pine. So you have both the flammability of the ponderosa pine and the potential fire behavior of the chaparral at certain times of the year. And that ecotone has broadened over the years so that now when we get a fire like this one, when it goes further up the slope and slams into the ponderosa pine, which we have not had fire, enough of the right kind of fire in, it takes out the first, certainly the first few rows, sometimes 100, 150 feet or so. But when you add that to the whole ecotone, that's a lot. And that's not something we've addressed yet. Move forward here. Well, just a little bit about patch dynamics, because I love the Great Plains still. This is some work that was done at the University of Oklahoma. David Engel, and I think Sam Pullendorf on this one as well. They're taking pastures and cows and trying to get a sense of how the patch grazing works. And you can see here where the cows are in the foreground, they can take a bite there and they're going to get just new growth. It's more nutritious. It's easier on their mouth physically. It's not going to poke them much, and they don't get a bite full of dry grass, which may have some nutrients, but it doesn't taste as good. So when you burn certain areas regularly, in this pasture they divide it up into 6 and burn them at separate times. You can tell where it's burned more recently because that's where the cows are going to hang out. The Great Plains had 3 major disturbances. There was fire, it was grazing, both prairie dogs and bison, and it was drought. And that combination of fire and grazing pretty much ran the landscape. And there's been a lot of work done lately, and more ranchers in the Great Plains I know are trying to manage this way, especially down in Texas. The patch dynamics also runs the size of fires, where they can go. This is Yellowstone. 1988 was the famous fire year in Yellowstone in that there were all kinds of fires. People talk about the fire in Yellowstone in 1988, but it was lots and lots of little ones. And you can see how it breaks the landscape up so that future fires aren't going to burn the same way. If you look, you can see dead trees in here and there. Some of that is from old fires, and some of that is from bugs, but just that variability of fire mosaics on the landscape. These were a couple of bigger ones when there was a windy day and it made a run. But you can see how that would affect any movement of fires in the future. And keeping fire in the landscape in these areas is critical for that reason, so you don't burn the whole thing to the ground. Okay, real talk. Real quick, Sonoran Desert. There's the Tonto. What you see is the Sonoran Desert that we have, which is the purple there. We have about 880,000 acres of it. It's the extreme northeast part, for the most part, of the Sonoran Desert, except for what's in the Grand Canyon. And it's a slightly higher elevation compared with a lot of the desert to the southwest there. And so that makes it even less stable. I'm not going to go through, well, here, we'll look at this real quick. So we don't know for sure what the fire regime of the desert was. There was fire in the desert, and it's the patterns of high severity that are very different now, and we just don't know. So what you're going to see here is a sequence of the footprint of the fires by the decade. So this is showing you in the slightly grayer area, the Sonoran Desert, where it's burned in the 1970s. And then we add the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and the 20 teens rather, and this is 2023 through 2023, and then this is adding this year we had 83,000 acres of desert burn just this last summer. What happens when the desert is burned, I'm not going to go through that right now, is it turns into, sorry, you saw a different version of this, it turns into grasslands. This is the historic desert, and you can see if you do what I call the match test. You walk out wherever it is, and I can look out the window and think, okay, what happens if I throw a match down? Is it going to burn? What kind of fire is it? Is it going to get over there? Will it get up into the trees? If you throw a match down here, in most places, it isn't going to do much. It isn't going to go far. It's just going to be really patchy. Well, we have two invasives in the northern Sonoran Desert that have been changing a lot. These were brought in to see if we could graze livestock successfully in the Sonoran Desert, and that's a whole different question. But let's just say it's bad. So red brome, Bromus rubens, is the primary driver of fire in the northern Sonoran Desert. In the southern Sonoran Desert, and I don't have any slides on it, it's buffole grass. So red brome is a cool season annual, so it has the same phenology as most of the desert forbs do. Some of them will come up, some of them are mostly warm season, but almost all of the flowers that everybody exclaims about in the desert and the diversity is the same phenology as red brome. So when it's flammable and burns, it also takes out plants, most of which don't have a lot of, we don't think anyway, have a whole lot of adaptations to fire. Certainly not to frequent fire. And then we also have, it's a schismus. We have two species of it. You can see the red brome in the foreground here and how the red brome likes to hang out and grow really dense under clumps of vegetation. And then the schismus comes in between the red brome and fills it in, and that helps fire go from point A to point B. So this was Tonto National Monument, June 21st, 2019. We knew it was going to burn in the woodberry fire, and so we put fire through it overnight so it would minimize some of the effects. You look at the size of the bushes in the foreground, and then look at the size of the bushes in the background. You can see there's been fire back in there somewhere in the last probably 10 or 15 years. I actually am working right now on, we found some maps that go back to 1938 with fire history in them. And I've got a woman actually from NAU who's just started helping me digitize what we found. But anyway, so that's the day before, then overnight we burned it. That's the next day. This is 1 year later. Same spot, obviously. You can see how fuzzy and soft that back hill looks with all the new grass coming in. It's still mostly red brome even after that. So 1 year later, after it burned, it still pops back like that. And then what really blew me away is, here's 1 year later. So this is 2021. This area burned in 2019. But the difference is this is August, or September rather, but this is mostly natives. That was almost all red brome. This is a mix of grama grasses and threons and God, I'm forgetting the other one. Green, no, green and yellow. Anyway, this is mostly native stuff. And so the differences when we move forward through 2022, you can see it is turning into a grassland. It burns more readily. It burns more quickly. And we don't really know what the ecological trajectory is other than some kind of a novel frequent fire grassland system. And we on the Tonto are struggling with that right now. I'll stop at that right now and move on to one last topic, and I'll try and make this super quick so we've got a few minutes for questions. I started getting interested in the effects of smoke in 2014. In summer of 2014, I did my first experiments in my backyard with exposing seeds to smoke or smoking the soil and planting the seeds in it, and variations on a theme there. And then a few months later, in November, this book came out. So I felt completely vindicated that I was on the right track and other people had been looking at this too. This is the research that's been done. On the vertical axis there is showing the number of species that have been researched for their effects, the impact or the effects of smoke. There's South Africa, and here's the U.S. And most of the U.S., especially that early stuff, was done by a gentleman, Professor John Keeley, who works for USGS out of California. And I don't have time. I don't want to get into too much detail right now because I really want to hear some stuff from you all. So I'm just going to show you a couple of the results. This is Penstemon barbatus, also known as bearded penstemon, really tall red one, really favored by a lot of pollinators. When I exposed the control, obviously no smoke. I planted 108 seeds. I got 15% sprouting. That goes up to 64% when I smoke both the seed and the soil. And so it looks like this is a graph. There's the control. That's when I smoked the soil but not the seed. That's the seed but not the soil. That's smoking the seed and the soil. This is smoking the seed but letting the soil or the smoke residue sit for a week before I planted it in unsmoked soil, and then that's the same thing with smoked soil. So definitely has this ecological role. When you apply this on a larger scale, I'm not going to go into, we don't have time for all this, but we don't know the effects on a lot of critters. We don't. We know some insects, but we really don't know anything about everybody else. Certainly not on a lot of plants, lichen, fungi, algae. We don't know. If you're looking for a PhD, there's a lot to be said there. And then think about, again, the footprint of the smoke. This is a prescribed fire down on Globe that we did last year. You can see the smoke's going over the line. There's a lot of it, and it did that for quite some time. So what is the ecology of smoke? What is the geography of the ecology of smoke? How often, where? This is Oak Creek Canyon outside of Sedona. So I've come up with this thing called a smoke regime that's similar to a fire regime, but it's based on the frequency, duration, and concentration of smoke from wildland fire in the environment. There's no question in my mind there are patterns here, but nobody has done this yet, and I don't have any researchers or time to deal with it. So last slide here, one more after this. I'd love to see it so that we have a burn plan at some point that is written rather than to avoid impacting areas with smoke. We write it so that we increase the duration and density of smoke in a certain area to help knock the mistletoe back, something like that. But right now, that's not likely. Anyway, that's, I'm sorry, that was me babbling on at warp 12 for an hour, or close to it, and I'm done for now. So I'm really
Thank you, Mary.
curious. What can you all tell me about what you've seen with smoke, especially, or any questions you have? But I'd really love to put together a research project with the geography of smoke.
Yeah, Mary, I'm super interested in that as well. And I never thought about it quite in that context. And I never thought about it as, frankly, an outright benefit to a lot of plants in the ecological role. That's fantastic.
Good. Well, I like it when I hear people thinking, wow, I hadn't, because now you will, and maybe somebody, I'd love to write a joint fire science proposal for that, but I'm buried all the time right now. I can't do it. But there's obviously a lot we could learn from that. And the effects on pollinators of the shift in species. I figure I need a soil scientist who can do the analysis on the smoke residue in the soil and give us a spatial picture of that. And then a team of botanists to go out and compare the species composition in those areas with areas that don't get much smoke that otherwise would be similar. But anyway.
And you need someone to do all the remote sensing to figure out where the smoke actually went and what density, and yeah.
Yep, all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, if anyone has questions, go ahead and either type them in the chat or just say them out loud. Turn your cameras on if you'd like. I can start with questions in just a minute. I've got a couple, but let anyone else go.
So I'm curious.
Mary,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Matt.
So on the Mogollon Rim, just because this is where I am locally, what direction is climate change pushing these ecosystems, and which direction is it pushing it towards?
Well, hotter, drier. What I see and what I think we can all figure is things are going to get hotter and drier in the Southwest. What we're maybe seeing already, it's maybe a little early to say, is that total precipitation may not change that much. But we're going to have longer, hotter, more frequent droughts. That's what the global models are telling us. But also the rain itself will get spottier. So let's say we still get, I don't know what it is, we get here 20 inches of rain, but it's going to be more concentrated and there'll be a longer, dry, hot period. And so where we have high severity fires in places that didn't evolve with high severity, it's going to be harder and harder for those areas to recover. For example, ponderosa pine projections are that a lot of places it is right now, and on the Tonto, it isn't going to be in a few decades. And yet, we're still planting ponderosa pine in areas of high severity fire. And ponderosa pine takes a few decades to mature, and so why are we doing that? That sort of management question. We are actually starting to try and we're hoping for a good year for Chihuahua pine because that can handle it better. So we will start planting that more. And I'm hoping we find Apache pine too, so we can collect from that. But in the government, if you don't already have a species in your management area and you want to bring something in, then you have to go through, understandably, some rigmarole and paperwork to do something we call assisted migration, where you bring it in from elsewhere because it'll be a different ecotype because you never had it. So I don't know what to think on the East Coast. I actually am not tracking well on what the projections are for climate change there. And East Coast fire regimes are so messed up already too. I'm guessing some of you folks from the East especially, have you read Changes in the Land? I would assume you would have had that, could pull it out real quick, that you would have had that assigned at some point. There's descriptions in there of the effects of fire and how the historic forests, the oak hickory forests in the East used to be ones you could run a horse through. And just like in the West, although you don't hear about it as much, I don't know if it's fire suppression or the lack of fire, because human-started fires would have been much more common there than they were probably in the West, because we had plenty of lightning. We didn't need to be starting them.
Mary, who's that book by?
Hold on half a second. I'm going to grab it real quick.
Yeah, I was going to ask that as well.
I might have taken it home. And there was also a guy. All right, I'll pull it up while we're talking. There's a guy named, all I remember is his last name is Brown. He's an ecologist from the East Coast. I think he's from Vermont, could be wrong, who has a series of videos online that are just phenomenal, where he walks out and he's reading the landscape. He's talking about the northeasters. Have you guys seen that?
I think I have, yeah. It's been a while, and it did strike me when I watched those. Yeah.
Those were, I was wishing there was somebody here who could do that. Here we go. Changes in the Land by William Cronin. Here, I'll pop this in there. Oh, well.
I've got a question too when you're ready.
Anytime.
So, working in such a complex environment and where the future and trajectory of these ecosystems is so unknown, how do you figure out how to write treatment objectives?
You have to look. We just recently revised our forest plan. So for the Tonto National Forest, we updated it officially. The new one was good to go as of December 8th last year. So it is really new, like less than a year. And myself and our botanist and a forester who'd been on this forest, this district for 35 years, all wrote the vegetation part. And we tried to account for things like management reality. So for example, I showed you This district should have, it's like 20 some thousand acres of fire in that. We tried to take that into account, and we also went back and looked at how many acres of mechanical treatments and how many acres of prescribed fire and how many acres of wildfire that was considered beneficial we were able to do each year on average for the last 10 years. And so that one we put as our minimum requirement, and then maximum what would have been ecologically sound, so that when people look at that, they're seeing, holy cow, that's a really big difference. That normally you'd say, so on this forest, we should be having about 135,000 acres of beneficial fire every year. And so we wrote that up in a way that people could see on the bottom end what's possibly realistic. Well, should be realistic. We should be able to do that without any trouble, but then be able to see all the way up to the upper end of what would be great if we could do, instead of saying, whatever it is, the low end, 22,000 to, okay, let's double that and hope we can do it. So then people would look at that and see 22,000 to 50,000. Oh, maybe we can get to 50,000. That's not where we need to be. We need to be at 135. So we made sure we wrote that in there. And we can't treat the whole landscape. That's the thing. There isn't a cure for it. Nobody has figured that out. I mean, we've figured out that we need to do that it would be great, but we know we can't do it. And so part of it is just, we don't talk about it. And part of it, honestly, and part of it is just prioritizing either areas we can get to or areas that, from a fire control perspective, are particularly important, or areas that, from an ecological perspective, although this is a lower priority always, from an ecological perspective, are particularly valuable or at risk.
So it's kind of a matter of, prioritizing where fire might be most beneficial, and then doing as much as you can with prescribed fire and kind of letting it do its thing.
Yeah, and then we do whatever we can on this forest with wildfire, because it's a lot easier sometimes. Well, not sometimes, it's a lot easier. Financially and planning wise, it's just a whole lot easier if we get a wildfire that's in a good spot. We just had one, actually the last 2 years, we had really great fires here in the Payson district that were wildfires.
Cool. Yeah, thanks.
Actually, I'm going to add on to that because it's a type of fire effect we never talk about. A year ago, we had a fire called the Valentine Fire here in the Payson district, and it started mid-August. I think it was August 16th. It was a lightning fire, and we watched it for a few days or a week. It was in a good spot. It was actually in an area that we had already been prepping for burning. It was just shy of 10,000 acre unit. And so we were able to use that fire for resource benefit, but we were able to not rush it too much. And so over a period of almost 10 weeks, we mostly let it do what it wanted to do. We do some ignitions to keep it from hooking up and running and things, but mostly we just were patient and kind of let it do what it wanted to do on the ground. And so the difference in fire effects on any given one given species in mid-August versus, say, late September are different. So that variability of fire effects on one species in one fire is something we don't often see. Even when we have the opportunity like that, we did it this year too, we pushed it a little more because people didn't want to go for 10 weeks again. I was like, oh, come on, But that's a tough one, and that's part of the realities and limitations of operational and logistical fire management. To be, I think, a really effective fire ecologist in management, you have to understand the realities of operational limitations and logistical operations, so that logistical realities, so you can try and work around them or work with them, make them work for you.
Anyone else have any questions we can give Mary real quick?
Jonathan's doing some pretty cool work. You could explain that real quick.
Sure, I could. Yeah, I'm a PhD student at Northern Arizona University, and I'm working on techniques to use terrestrial LiDAR to speed up fuel treatment monitoring, especially being able to get in with this 3D scanner that you can bring out to the field with you, and you can do scans before and after treatments like thinning or prescribed fire, and you can really quickly get precise quantitative measurements of both canopy fuels and surface fuels to see how the vegetation structure is changing as a result of treatments or other effects over time.
We were absolutely intrigued to see the pre and post imagery when that's available.
Yeah, sorry,
Don't
I'll send you
apologize.
something after this chat. Yeah, thank you.
That's super cool, Jonathan. I've worked as a fire effects monitor in the past, and we were always taking TLS data, and we had
Oh,
nothing
really?
to do with it. And so I know there's programs out there in the country, especially with the Park Service, who've been collecting those data for years and have been slowly trying to figure out what to do with it. And that's awesome because everyone knows the intent and the goal is exactly what you're talking about. And just getting there has been a little bit sticky for some people, I think.
Yeah, maybe I'll connect with you later also too then. You're also at NAU?
Yeah.
Awesome.
The processing speed is what's been tripping us. The last we understood, one of those units costs about 30,000, 35,000, something like that. And although it would be quick, we could pay for a seasonal or so with that money. On the other hand, then there's the need for some computer that can process that kind of data because it's pretty impressive. You know, it's huge, enormous data clouds.
Yeah, definitely challenges, but we've been working through them.
Cool. Well, we're looking forward to it whenever it's ready. We'll be patient, but we will keep asking because we're just curious.
Yeah, happy to share soon.
Hey, and I'm curious, for those of you who are in places I haven't worked, and it looks like there's quite a few of you. So I only spent a little time on the East Coast, well, 3 years there, but I wasn't doing ecology. I was a rehab therapist and musician, nothing like that. So I'm curious, what are some of the fire issues where you're at? What do you look at? What do you study? I know there have been issues right now in New Jersey, New York, and a young man was killed a few days ago. What are the things that you guys study about fire ecology in the East and the Southeast? The Midwest, I know a little bit, but it's been a while. Dead silence. Okay.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello.
Catherine.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
I live in Chicago, and I went to Loyola University studying environmental science. We talk a lot about prairie restoration and doing controlled burns like that in my area.
Who does the burning?
There's like burn crews that do it. There's a organization called Open Lands, and they're doing a lot of prairie restoration and stuff like that. And we did control burns at our ecology campus outside the city too.
Awesome. One of the great things about grass burns is there's not much mop up.
Yeah, pretty easy.
Still, it moves fast though. You can get caught in them.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I remember from the fire ecology class I took at Northern Iowa. The way the professor described it there was as if the tallgrass prairie was a 1,000-piece puzzle that had been left out in the rain. And there were a few pieces here and there that we still had, but the dog chewed on them. And that's what we had to try and put everything back together. So we won't ever. That system's
Yeah.
it's no longer functional by itself, but we have most of the pieces. We just don't have a big enough piece to make it really work.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool though. Have you been to the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve that the Park Service runs?
The one in Medewin, Illinois.
No, it's Kansas.
Oh, I
Eastern
haven't been
Kansas.
to that. No.
That
I've
one's
been to the one
gorgeous.
in Illinois. That's Medewin. think it's a national prairie. It used to be an Army munitions plant, and they pretty much deactivated the base and turned it back into prairie, and they have bison and a bunch of cool stuff.
I haven't been there for probably 30 years. I was there once, a long time ago.
It's pretty nice.
Actually, the wildlife biologist on the Tonto right now came from a day when,
That's awesome. Yeah.
I don't know if you knew the name Drew Olberg.
No, I don't know the name, but write it down.
And Eric Olson, I see you're from Las Vegas. Are you at UNLV?
I think Eric might have dropped off.
Oh, okay, I wondered because um, one of the guys who's done a lot of work with smoke actually is from UNLV. Let's see who else we have. Idaho. My first exposure to fire in Idaho was when I was a Girl Scout counselor in 1987. Are you still there? Is it Oleg? Nope.
Nope.
Nope, they're dropping like flies.
Yeah, we might be wrapping it up here in just a minute, Mary. Thank you.
Sure.
I really appreciate the talk and all of these little insights, and like I wasn't expecting to get book recommendations out of this talk, and that's excellent. I'm really thankful for it, and it is something we've kind of touched on. The first speaker of this series was Dr. Morgan Varner at Tall Timbers, and that was kind of one of the things he was excited about, thinking of is smoke and modeling smoke and smoke impacts, and it's something
Awesome.
that people are really starting to talk about more and trying to figure out how to begin to tackle it.
Yes, it makes me feel good. I put together a session for RX 310. I don't know if you guys know that. Introduction to fire effects. It's one of the basic, it's really the only, it's called Introduction to Fire Effects for the Forest Service. It's not required for very many fire positions, but
I've taken it.
I wrote a smoke ecology section for it, which they use now, and they're revising it for their newest one, which is pretty cool. They're coming up with a new revision of the course and including smoke now officially, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Mary, will you be at the Southwest Fire Ecology Conference next week?
I have put together 3 90-minute sessions on fire in the Sonoran Desert, as well as a fire circle on fire in the Sonoran Desert. So yes, and I'm helping teach FFI with a guy from Missoula on Monday.
Excellent. Well, I'll be there. I'll make sure to run into you and say hi. I've got some questions about
please.
soil heating and
Okay,
yeah, that I want to chat with you about. So,
you bet.
well, if anyone else doesn't have any questions, I think we're going to end it here. Thank you all for coming, attending.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks so
I
much.
wish SAFE had been around when I was in school. It's cool.
Hey, Mary, do you still have a minute?
You bet.
Hey, so I'm currently working with the Forest Service in Vermont, and we've mostly been. I actually haven't been here very long. Most of my experience is out west, so I'm still kind of learning the new ecosystems and fuel types. But they mostly burn to maintain openings for wildlife on the forest because it's otherwise a pretty closed, even age stand forest. But we're looking to burn more for oak woodland restoration because there's actually quite a bit of oak on some of the slopes as well. And then we do have some rare plant communities that we're hoping to reinvigorate, some small pitch pine communities and huckleberry heath.
Oh, I love huckleberries. It's my favorite fruit.
Yeah, so it's really a kind of a fascinating time to be here, but it's also a bit daunting. I feel like fire ecology in the east is dwarfed by kind of the research out west. So I'm still trying to figure out where to actually start, and I'm still early in my my master's in fire ecology, so I'm mostly doing stuff on the ground, but
I could give you a couple of contacts, I think, if you send me your email. I don't
Yeah,
know if
certainly.
East Fire is still there or not. That used to be at George Mason University. They paid my way to a
Hmm.
conference in 2010, I think it was. Um, anyway, I could find out that guy's name, and if they're still around, that would certainly be a place to dig in a little bit.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm trying to see real quick if they're still there. They were kind of a, huh. But anyway, I'll see what I can find on that for you, because I think fire is a big missing component from the whole East Coast. Certainly, there was fire there. They lived in a flammable environment and had reason to burn once in a while for lots of reasons. So we've kind of lost that.
Yeah, yeah, that's another piece that's tough is we had a really good workshop earlier in August for Northeast and all of Northeast and Midwest
Cool.
prescribed fire, and there was a lot of emphasis on connecting with our tribal partners and trying to uh, figure out how they can lead the way with bringing fire back on the landscape.
They've
And
done that in some areas because on their own lands where they have them,
mhm,
they don't have the restrictions that we do, and they can do what they need to do.
yeah, but in Vermont, we don't really have those connections that I'm aware of either. Um, but yeah, I'm definitely going to check out that book. And
If I can find the George Mason University, I can't remember the guy's name. He's probably retired, but God. And then there's the Park Service in the East Coast too, because they have been using fire in their national parks in the East. They always do where they can, but it's, a little tiny postage stamp on a big landscape.
yeah, I know the state of Maine does a lot of burning, and New Hampshire has both New Hampshire and Maine have a much more active fire season than we do in Vermont. But I'm also really curious to see too how that changes with the climate um, shifting. So I think the latest I heard is that we are predicted to get warmer and wetter, but that might alternate with more extreme drought as well, as we're seeing
It's
right
hard to
now.
grow anything. Have you looked on the Fire Effects information system?
Not lately.
They might. I mean, if you look in there and look under the fire regime area, there's likely to be some stuff in there that would have citations and such for different ecosystems that should include some from the Northeast.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Should. I'm sure it does. It's actually a pretty amazing. I would hope that most people here are familiar with that. It's a pretty remarkable resource. I haven't looked for stuff since actually I've never looked up stuff in the Northeast because when I lived there I didn't do ecology. Can you put your email in the chat?
Yeah, for sure.
Jamie or Catherine, any other questions? You don't have to have any. Just curious. This has
I
been a
don't
good
really,
conversation.
yeah, I don't really have any right now. I'm just taking some of the classes through FEMA to get certified for burn crew type stuff. I graduated Loyola in May, and so I'm just kind of trying to figure out where to go. I was in the Marine Corps before I was at Loyola, and I was a firefighter in the Marine Corps, so I kind of miss firefighting, so.
Well, there's certainly plenty of that to be had. Unfortunately, we just finished our we call it fire hire for the year, literally finished it
Yeah.
last week.
Okay,
Because
yeah.
because of the bean counters in Washington, we now do the hiring. It's stupid. It starts at the end of our fire season, like in August.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow people are supposed to know what they're going to do next year, and we're all pretty
Yeah.
unhappy about it. But there are also pretty active women in wildfire programs in a lot of places. Thus, we even have stickers and things like this.
Okay,
Um,
writing it down. Wild.
So we do Women in Wildfire Boot Camp on our forest. We've done it every year. The Forest Service had really huge budget cuts this year, and so we haven't
Yeah.
been able to fill our regular positions, but definitely something to be looking into. And if you like the eco thing too, then look at fire effects monitor positions.
Okay, yeah,
I'm
I'd
gonna
like that
chime
more
in.
than the firefighting
Yeah, Matt, you
because
said you
Yeah.
did that too, right?
I'm going to
yeah.
chime in here, Catherine. I've done that, but I also know that Grand Canyon and some of the Wyoming announcements just opened up today or yesterday for Fire
Okay.
Effects Monitor for the National Park Service. So look in
Awesome.
USA Jobs under Fire Effects Monitor, and there's some GS5 positions in there that are really a great fit, and those programs are really good. I'm happy to talk to you more about those if you're interested.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
would be.
Yeah, I'll drop my
a
email
lot
in the
of
chat
fire
as well.
ecologists. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No.
I was going to say a lot of fire ecologists I know, and some of the best ones started as fire effects monitors with Park Service.
Yeah, it sounds good. I'm thinking about going into like more of the less of the frontline stuff and more of the ecology stuff,
Oh, well,
probably.
that'd be the way to go. Definitely the way to
Yeah.
start. You learn a lot. You learn a
Yeah.
little bit of operations, a little bit of logistics, and a lot of the ecology. But keep in mind the Park Service is kind of it's like the Cadillac of fire effects monitoring. I don't have any crews. I work with botany a lot, but it's always scrambling to try and find the time and the people to do it. So that's a good place to start because you'll form good habits and a good appreciation of monitoring, unlike the Forest Service or the BLM.
Yeah. Thank you again for your time. I have to
You
get
bet.
going, but I can drop my email in the chat. Thank you again for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming. Okay. Jamie, do you have any comments or questions or anything?
I don't really have any questions or comments, but I really appreciate being able to listen to the talk. I'm a firefighter currently looking to switch it up in the next couple of years, so it's really interesting to hear about the ecology, even though I'm feeling pretty out of my depth at the moment.
You shouldn't, because I always tell people, and I didn't say it on here, but I should have. I usually do. I'm kind of embarrassed I didn't now. A lot of the stuff that I pick up, I either listen to folks who've been working on the land for a long time in fire, or I'll run things past them. As my example is always, especially in the Sonoran Desert and the systems on the Tonto that I didn't grow up with. They know what this plant is going to do. They know when it is flammable. They know how it's going to burn. They know how it's going to respond to fire, but they call it buckbrush, and I call it, something else with a fancy scientific name. But they know it better than I do. They know the ecology. They know an awful lot about the system. I'm tired of hearing, I'm just a dumb firefighter. Like, oh, come on, You just don't want to do the work of writing something down, but you know more than I do about it, so.
Oh yeah, I get that. I work with some people who've been working on this forest since before 2000. It's really interesting to listen to their experiences and yeah, I play the dumb firefighter thing, but it's kind of fun to just be out there and working hard, maybe not thinking about it as much sometimes. But we're changing that. I'll be doing that.
That's good. But being out there is important though, because as I'd say, I'm a FOBS, a single resource. I learn a lot from that. That's where you get that interaction that teaches you what the limitations are and aren't, and what you really can and can't do out there with fire. And it helps you share that with other people, especially other resources who don't work in fire and they don't understand why you can't just not burn that area. It doesn't work like that. We have to bring it out to here. So it's going to be 7,000 acres we can't burn, not just that 200 you're worried about, that kind of thing. So You're learning that now. That's really good info to have. You can't teach it. You got to learn it.
And I guess I am a little curious though, are there any certs that you would recommend that I get while I am still a wildland firefighter before trying to like move to maybe a fire effects crew or something else?
Well, the fire effects crews are something I always highly recommend if you have any interest in fire ecology. Definitely do that. One of the quals, which I'm sorry it isn't pushed more, and some land management areas focus on it more than others, is FEMO. It's a qualification. It's a cert as a fire effects monitor, which is different than the job in the Park Service that's called a fire effects monitor. They're not the same thing. The FEMO is just a firefighter 2 qual. Your job is to be out there documenting fire behavior. And a lot of times they'll try and get you to do the weather all the time, but that's not a good way to spend a FEMO. And if you stayed in long enough and kept at it, then I would recommend FOBS. It's sort of like a single resource FEMO, but you have to have another single resource first. So I'm an engine boss
I have
too.
my FEMO class book, but there's no FEMOs on my forest, so I have the task book and no way to work on it apparently.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah,
Is there a
That's
preference?
incredible. That's horrible, actually, that no one else can
It's
train you.
not unusual. We've got one more. Other than me, we have another one on the Tonto who I just signed off last spring, finally. And he's actually one of the Payson hotshots, which is pretty cool. We don't even have any other trainees because people tell them, oh, well, you should be working on task force or you should be working on this or that. And yeah, finally, it's unfortunate. But we use them when we have them. And they have to find them because we're supposed to use them. So
We'll go be ADing next spring and fall for that. That might be good.
if you're FEMO qual, I've got a list of FEMOs. Seriously, I put it together last spring because I was finally fed up with people coming to me at the last minute and saying, hey, we're going to burn next week. And I'm like, well, that's great. I'm not going to be here. You know? Can you help us find a FEMO? So now I have a list. I'm happy to send it to you guys if you want it, if it's going to help you get trainee assignments.
I would actually love a list of any FEMOs you could connect me with because I have a lot of flexibility getting some training assignments early season.
Let me see if I can stick this in the chat. How do I add something? Let's see. Oh, there we go. No. Oh, there we go. Can I add a document to the chat?
I think so. If you look down at the very bottom of the chat bar, there's a tab that says File, or like a little icon. It's a little rectangle, and if you hover over it, it says File.
Mine is stuck on trying to have me write a response to Josh, and I can't figure out how to get out of that. Whoops,
So
nope,
maybe if you click to everyone, so there's that little, where under the two, there's like a blue button that's a little drop down, and you might have to change that back to say everyone.
where is that?
Does that help? At the very bottom of the chat, there's like where you can type.
I'm going to share my screen so you can tell me where I should be going here. Do you see it then over here?
Yeah, so
I can't seem to get out of here. And this
okay, so hover over that where it says Joshua. See if you can change that to say everyone.
Oh, duh.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
that was
select
easy.
everyone. And then I can't see the very bottom of your screen, but at the very bottom of mine, of that little window, oh, you don't have a file thing.
Yeah, I don't either.
Oh, okay. That might just be attendees don't have that access. So we could just send it by email if you wanted Jamie to put your email in.
Oh, that's a link. Yeah, I'll just send it via email. That'll work. Is that LLRR?
Yep, that's correct. LLRR.
Okay, I'll just send this to, yeah, I've got the rest of you guys. Okay, that'll work.
Awesome.
Okay,
Thanks so
and I
much,
got to
Mary.
attach a couple other things here too, so.
Great. Yeah. I'm gonna tag you down, Mary, when we're in Santa Fe. I've got
Okay, good.
plenty more stuff I want to talk about, so I'll find you.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll see you all next week then.
Yeah.
Well, some of
See you
you.
next week.
Okay, bye. Bye, Jamie.
Thank you.
Bye, Anna.
Hey,
Bye,
thanks so
Annie. Bye,
much.
Matt.
Talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Bye.